Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. So first off, let me just to kind of quickly introduce myself. I'm Chad. If you attended the last webinar, then that was, we were talking about intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. I'm the VP of International for Attuned. Our presenter today is Dr. Melissa Tarantola. She has her PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Missouri, close to my hometown in Oklahoma. So we're neighbors, and is a member of Attuned's R&D team. So Melissa is leading the creation of Attuned's own psychological safety assessment and intervention program. As part of her work with Attuned, she spent the last 10 months of her life going on a super deep dive into psychological safety, scientific literature, and thinking deeply on the topic. And today she's going to share some of the insights that she's gained from her time with all this research. I just also wanted to let everyone know that at the end of the presentation, we will have time for Q&A. Please submit your questions in the Q&A feature. You can do that at any point during the presentation, but we'll have the question and answer specifically once she's finished the main presentation. We will be answering the questions. We won't be doing live question and answer for today's webinar. So please, if you put your hand up, I'll just ask you to put your question in the Q&A. So without any further ado, let me pass over to Melissa.
Thanks for that, Chad. And thanks so much, everyone, for coming today. So I'm going to begin this presentation by explaining a little bit about what psychological safety is. So the standard definition of psychological safety that's offered by the concept's leading researcher, Harvard's Amy Edmondson, is the shared belief amongst members of a group that it is safe to engage in risky behaviors. So if you're anything like me, the first time I saw that definition, I did not find it to be particularly informative. So for the first part of the presentation, I'm going to share with you two pieces of information that I've come across that helped me to achieve a deeper understanding of what psychological safety is. And that first piece of information was learning what is meant by risky behaviors, specifically learning the source of risk and also what is being risked. But before explaining that, first let me give you some examples of the kind of risky behaviors that are relevant for psychological safety. Behaviors such as asking for help, admitting to mistakes, giving feedback to teammates, making improvement suggestions, sharing innovative or out-of-the-box ideas, sharing knowledge, expressing disagreement, saying no or setting boundaries, or showing the non-professional parts of your personality. So what is the source of risk in these risky behaviors? In other words, where is the risk coming from? The source of risk is your coworkers, specifically your coworkers' responses to these behaviors. These behaviors are risky because there's the potential that your coworkers will have a negative reaction to them. We are humans. We worry about our coworkers misunderstanding us, thinking we're incompetent, weird, or annoying. We worry about being yelled at, about being rejected or made fun of. These are the negative responses people are worried about, and the potential to have those experiences when engaging in these behaviors is the source of risk. So as this picture demonstrates, giving a presentation is a risky behavior because there's the risk that your coworkers will react to your presentation like these people, with eye rolling, looking bored, not paying attention, etc. If your coworkers react like that to one of your presentations, that would probably make you feel pretty bad about yourself and make you question your ability to give a good presentation. This last point leads us into the second part of my explanation about risky behaviors, which is to explain what specifically is being risked. What specifically does your coworkers' negative reactions put at risk? What is being risked is damage to your self-esteem and or self-efficacy. Specifically, when you engage in these behaviors, you put yourself at risk of having your self-esteem or self-efficacy hurt by your coworkers' negative reactions. So I assume everyone knows what self-esteem is, but I'll quickly explain self-efficacy. Self-efficacy refers to the feeling or belief that you are capable of being effective. In other words, when your self-efficacy is high, you feel like if you try to do something, if you put effort in towards it, you will be able to do it. You will be able to succeed. So it's obvious why we'd want to avoid hurting self-esteem, because we like to feel good about ourselves. And the reason we don't want our self-efficacy to be damaged is because it's essential for feeling motivated at work, for feeling like the work you do is valuable and meaningful. If you feel like no matter how hard you try, you will never succeed at your job, you're not going to feel very motivated or excited to go to work. You'll become disengaged and unhappy. So carrying that belief that you can succeed if you try is very important. So to summarize, the risky behaviors referred to in the definition of psychological safety are behaviors that, if performed, there is a risk that one's coworkers will respond negatively in a way that damages self-esteem or self-efficacy. Okay, so remember how I told you there were two pieces of information that I learned that helped me to understand psychological safety better? Well, understanding what risky behaviors was the first piece of information. And the second piece of information was to understand what is meant by safe. When you say members of a team feel safe, what that means is that members of the team feel that their self-esteem and or self-efficacy will not be damaged if they engage in the risky behaviors we just discussed. In other words, they feel comfortable performing those risky behaviors because they believe there's a low likelihood that their coworkers will respond in such a way that their self-esteem or self-efficacy will be damaged. When someone works on a psychologically safe team, these are some of the adjectives that they might use to describe their team, or words they would use to describe how they feel when interacting with members of their team. Terms like unguarded, valued, authentic, effortless, predictable, caring. As you might notice, these are some of the words that many people would use to describe their relationship with their closest family member or best friend, that person in your life who you feel totally comfortable being yourself around. Hopefully everyone has at least one relationship like that in their life. With your mom or your best friend, for example, you don't spend time worrying about things like, if I say this, is my mom gonna think I'm uncool and stop calling me? No, you don't think about that stuff. You assume that even if you make the worst joke in the world or have some failure in your life, your mom or your best friend is going to give you the benefit of the doubt. They're not going to harshly judge you or reject you. So when you're trying to understand what psychological safety feels like, think about how you feel around your mom, your best friend, or whoever that person is, because that is the ultimate example of psychological safety, one that is probably unrealistic to achieve at work, but should at least help you conceptualize what psychological safety is. So when someone says a team is psychologically safe, what are the characteristics of that team? First, interactions between team members are effortless. And by effortless, I mean the opposite of walking on eggshells. You don't have to engage in significant behavioral alteration or self-monitoring. You don't have to spend time preparing for interactions, trying to think about how to say something so that you don't get embarrassed or yelled at. You don't get stressed before going into an interaction because you're expecting to be disrespected, ignored, or misunderstood, etc. Again, thinking about spending time with your mom or your best friend, you don't have to put in any effort into those interactions. You just show up as yourself. Second, supportive relationships. Employees will feel safe when they believe that members of their team are supportive of each other, specifically when they feel like their teammates value and care about each other as people. You don't necessarily have to be friends with each other. Instead, there's just some level of genuine concern and interest that exists. And people expect their teammates value their work. They will stand up for each other if there are injustices. They won't throw each other under the bus. And they prioritize each other's well-being and comfort over the company's bottom line. And finally, the last characteristic of a psychologically safe team is a positive bias. Specifically, a tendency for team members to view each other's behavior through a positive filter. Basically, what this means is that team members carry the default assumption that the other members of their team are competent, responsible, productive, likable, etc. Unless, of course, there's an objective and reasonable reason to not think so. And the reason this positive bias is important for psychological safety is because it gives the team members confidence that they will be given the benefit of the doubt, that if you make a mistake, your teammates will assume it's a fluke instead of a red flag revealing the true nature of your competence. That if you make a really bad joke, your teammates will assume that it was a one-time thing instead of labeling you as a weirdo and no longer inviting you to go out to lunch. So this positive bias gives you confidence that you can make mistakes, share your dumb ideas, make a joke that falls totally flat, etc., without being forever negatively judged and labeled. So in summary, a team that possesses these three characteristics should have employees that feel safe. So before we move on, I also want to quickly define what psychological safety is not. It is not some cozy, backslapping boys club where employees are coddled and everyone is friends. It is not giving employees free rein or never saying no, where you accept and ignore careless, irresponsible, or offensive behavior. In fact, when psychological safety increases, it should become easier and more natural to tell your teammates no and to call them out when they're being irresponsible or offensive. Going back to the example earlier, where I said psychological safety is like your mom or best friend, just because you feel safe with your mom or best friend, just because you know that they love you and accept you no matter what, does not mean that you can behave disrespectfully towards them. You still feel motivated to follow common rules of decency. Psychological safety is not overlooking objective and genuine instances of incompetence. On the previous slide, I said it's important that employees be given the benefit of the doubt, that the default assumption is that team members are competent workers and likable humans. However, there is objective and reasonable evidence that team members lack competency or necessary skills, then the way psychological safety should function is to empower other team members to point out that lack of competence. Psychological safety is not avoidance of conflict or even reduced conflict. In fact, when psychological safety increases, you will likely notice an increase in conflict. But instead of destructive conflict that occurs in a psychologically safe team environment will be productive and lead to enhanced team performance. And finally, psychological safety is not sacrificing expertise-based authority. Research has shown that when you compare high and low psychological safety teams, there is no difference in how team members rate their team leaders' expertise and authority. Okay, so now that we have a deeper understanding of what psychological safety is, let's discuss the benefits. So in a nutshell, the benefit of psychological safety is that it allows workers to stop focusing on self-protection and blame and start focusing on achieving shared goals. Instead of people spending time and energy worrying about things like, how should I say this? Should I say this? Does everyone hate me now? People can instead put that energy and mental space into their work. And this freeing up of energy and time has been demonstrated by research to be associated with a veritable buffet of benefits. Just to give a few examples, psychological safety has been shown to be associated with enhanced team performance, such as greater goal achievement and return on assets, enhanced creativity and innovation, improved communication in the form of more knowledge sharing, feedback giving, and error reporting, increased levels of work engagement and organizational commitment. And one of the most impressive benefits I found in the literature is the strong and direct effect of psychological safety on reduced turnover risk. Psychological safety has been shown to be an even more direct and powerful effect than other factors that have historically been associated with turnover, such as job satisfaction, leadership style, and organizational commitment. In fact, the research on this topic really suggests that psychological safety represents one of the most powerful tools that companies can use to directly reduce turnover. Psychological safety also appears to be the most powerful tool companies can use to increase team effectiveness. At this point, it's likely you've heard about Google's Project Aristotle, but just a quick refresher. Google did a huge study with 180 different teams where they compared 250 different team characteristics to try to figure out which one was predictive of team effectiveness. And the number one predictor out of all 250 was psychological safety. I also want to point out one more big benefit of psychological safety, and that is its effect on intrinsic motivation. For those of you not familiar with intrinsic motivation, it is considered the highest quality form of motivation that's associated with a myriad of benefits, both for companies' bottom line and for the well-being of employees. And very recently, researchers have begun to look at the connection between psychological safety and intrinsic motivation. And research findings have shown that interventions aimed at increasing psychological safety also increase intrinsic motivation. Okay, so now that you know what psychological safety is and you're convinced of all of its amazing benefits, let's discuss how you can create it. I want to begin by emphasizing that psychological safety is not all about sunshine and roses. Like I said before, it's not a cozy backslapping environment where everyone gets to do what they want and never have to hear hard feedback. In order to get the benefits from psychological safety that I just discussed, there also needs to be standards for excellence. Team leaders need to enforce high performance standards that keep people accountable and motivate them to work hard. Another important point to make is that psychological safety is a team level variable. In other words, the primary place that psychological safety exists is on teams. And what this means is that any psychological safety interventions you take need to be happening at the team level. Many companies make the mistake of having upper level management or HR drive the psychological safety interventions. But research has shown that upper level management support actually has very weak or no effect on reported levels of psychological safety. So interventions need to be happening in team settings, and it needs to be team leaders who are conducting and carrying out the interventions. In any psychological safety intervention you take, the overarching goal should be to reduce uncertainty and enhance predictability of teammates' responses, specifically to help your team members begin to predict positive responses from each other. When you can't predict how your teammates are going to respond to your engagement in those risky behaviors, it's going to be really hard to feel safe. So anything that will help team members get to know each other and get to know the team leader, all of that will go towards reducing uncertainty, which in turn will produce psychological safety. Furthermore, the better teammates know each other, the more likely they are to form those supportive relationships that are so essential for psychological safety. And a quick tip, usually the best way for team members to get to know each other is to create opportunities for unstructured, non-work focused interaction time. Take your team out to lunch, a board game night, take the day to go to the zoo together, etc. Now I'm going to go through some tips for creating psychological safety that have been suggested by researchers. Most strategies for creating psychological safety have the same starting point. Have a discussion with your team. Introduce the concept of psychological safety and provide a convincing rationale for why it's important. Then give the team space to express their impressions of psychological safety and validate any concerns they might have. During this discussion, there should be two other points that you try to make. First, make sure to emphasize that teamwork is essential. Emphasizing the essentialness of teamwork will help employees to feel that their ideas and voices matter, giving them more confidence that if they do speak up or share ideas, that others will react positively to that behavior. Second, make sure to explicitly recognize that the work you and your team do is hard and complex. If your employees believe their work is complex, then they will believe it's natural and expected for them to make mistakes. And thus, they will spend less time and effort worrying about having their mistakes and failures judged negatively. The next step is for team leaders to start modeling psychological safety promoting behaviors. One of the most essential things team leaders should model is a willingness to be candid about when they don't know something or when they make mistakes. Team leaders should share their stories about mistakes and failures and frame them as learning opportunities. Team leaders should also explicitly encourage their team members to provide them with critical feedback, to report concerns and suggestions for improvement. In fact, team leaders should proactively ask their team members questions like, do you have any suggestions? Do you have any concerns? If team members do feel safe enough to provide critical feedback or to admit making mistakes, team leaders should not react by getting mad, blaming, punishing, or calling team members' skills or competence into question. Instead, thank them for telling you. And most importantly, genuinely listen to them. Take time to critically think about what they said. And if their suggestion or concern is valid and reasonable, act on it. Other important behaviors to model include ensuring everyone's voice is heard, for example, by giving everyone a chance to contribute during discussions. Also, try to be more friendly and approachable. Try implementing a "my door is always open" policy. When you arrive at the office in the morning, spend 5 minutes to chat with your teammates and ask them how their weekend was. Basically, just show you are interested in them as people and that you are open to and enjoy talking with them. And finally, try to reduce hierarchy. Team leaders should stop thinking about themselves as the order giver or captain of the ship, and instead think about themselves as a team member. Turn to your employees for help and advice. Delegate parts of your tasks to them. Allow yourself to depend on them for achieving your goals. And this whole process will likely require baby steps, but once you have people on board and testing the waters, the next step is to try to build in structures designed specifically to elicit employee engagement in those risky behaviors like error reporting and help seeking. For example, you could schedule once monthly meetings where all employees, even those who are lowest on the totem pole, are asked for their input about how things are going, if they notice any room for improvements, or have seen any mistakes being made. You could also consider setting up peer-to-peer learning structures, like the G2G system Google uses, where employees volunteer to form pairs, serving in both the position as teacher and learner. And finally, you can create psychological safety by using Attuned. We are currently in the process of creating a psychological safety assessment and intervention program. Unlike existing assessments, which can only tell you if your team has high or low psychological safety, our assessment will be able to tell you about your team's level of psychological safety for specific behaviors, such as innovation and learning. Furthermore, our assessment will include a component in which we diagnose the specific behaviors that are contributing to low psychological safety, and then use that data to make tailored, evidence-based intervention recommendations. If you're interested, check back in later this summer when we launch our assessment. And while you're waiting for that, we're going to send everyone who attended this webinar a free motivator assessment. So please keep an eye out for that in your emails. All right, that's all I have for today. So now I'm going to take questions if anyone has any.
Thank you very much, Melissa. I appreciate the information. I wanted to give people a minute to get their questions in. And so I thought I would ask a quick question that I personally had, if that's all right. So one of the things that you talked about is psychological safety really starts on the team level, right? And if you're in a position where you're an HR manager, HR director, or in a more senior role where you can see that your organization might have some problems with psychological safety, how do you think you can get people on board with the idea that they need to make changes, where I think we've all dealt with maybe managers who are maybe a little bit stuck in their ways or a little bit stubborn. Do you have any tips that you could provide for maybe kind of selling those people on the benefits?
Yeah, so I really think that using an approach that enhances autonomy is really going to be helpful for you. First, so in order to produce this kind of like autonomous motivation to engage in this psychological safety intervention, really you want to do anything you can to provide a convincing rationale, helping people understand like, why is this important? Why are you doing it? How are you going to benefit from doing it? That's really essential. Second is offering people a chance to express their concerns, like, those managers who are feeling like, I just don't have time for this, etc. Give them space to express those concerns, validate those concerns. That will really help people feel heard and understood, even if you don't end up actually listening to them and still going forward with the safety intervention. Just giving them a chance to feel heard will be important. And then finally, any chance you can do to offer people choice is really going to, again, help get people on board. So if you can, let's work together to see if we can think of some things that we can do to increase psychological safety, or, here are some options we have. Which of these sound good for you? I think all of those three things, the rationale, giving space to express concerns, and then offering choice would really help people get on board with that.
Wonderful, thank you. We have a question in the chat as well. And that question is, what would be good questions for managers to use when starting the discussion with their team?
Good questions to use. Okay. Like to get the discussion going, I'm assuming. Is that what this?
I think that's what this person means. I think they're thinking about, like, they want to start building that culture of psychological safety. They want to start the conversation. What are some good questions they could maybe ask to the individual or to the group to kind of get that going?
Oh, okay. I guess it depends on how safe your team is. If, your team is relatively safe, you've achieved, some level where people aren't terrified and might actually be willing to speak candidly, you could start the discussion by asking people, how they feel on the team, if there's anything they've noticed, perhaps. If the team is really unsafe, you might start by doing an anonymous, maybe using an assessment anonymously to get people's responses and kind of use that to build from there. Yeah, that'd probably be my recommendation. Sorry, I don't have a great answer to that.
Yeah. What would you think? Because you also mentioned things like team events and trying to build togetherness and trust through activities. Like, would that be something that people could look at to kind of build? Because, like, I think what you're saying is, if there's not a base level of safety, then the first question is actually kind of difficult, right? Like,
yeah. So, and actually, as we talk about too, with Japan, where, like, kind of having these face-to-face meetings and discussing these hard questions openly in team meeting settings is kind of difficult. So you could, consider trying to have these conversations in informal settings. Again, going out to lunch, giving people kind of chat, say, today we want to talk about psychological safety. It doesn't have to be in a group context, but maybe, you guys could take time to break off into pairs and talk to each other about what you've noticed. Or maybe even the team leader steps out of the room briefly to give team members a chance to discuss on their own without kind of the team leader's presence there to maybe kind of freak people out a little bit. So
that's a really interesting idea, actually, to give them space to talk. I think that might that lack of control might freak people out. And actually, the next question that I want to address maybe kind of gets to that point as well. So this person asks, or it kind of states, like, generally managers who don't create a safe environment don't recognize or acknowledge their own role in the situation. So what can senior management do to, what steps can they take to address this?
Yeah, that's, I think, one of the hardest things is definitely when you have a manager that's not on board and is, really hesitant. And again, like I said before, I mentioned, like, psychological safety does not mean a loss of authority or expertise. But a lot of managers feel that way. I really think, if the senior management has to step in, doing something like using a company-wide assessment, not to plug Attuned again, but, just anything that you can do where you have maybe multiple teams taking these assessments, so you can kind of come forward with that data and really saying, like, look, compared to these other teams, you're not performing as well. That might be one way to kind of get them on board. Again, that might be kind of hard if the team really feels so unsafe. They might not be willing to be very candid or honest on those assessments, but that really could be one place to start. And again, giving them a chance to address their concerns. Like, if you have to take a manager, maybe senior management has like a one-on-one meeting with the manager, really to see, like, what's going on, why is this not convincing you? What do you think is stopping you from believing this, and just giving them a space to really express why they're not feeling a certain way, or why they're not agreeing, and why they don't think they need to do these things can be, I think, should be really helpful.
And correct me if I'm wrong, what you're saying is that senior management needs to have psychological safety as a group to be able to talk to the managers and give them that kind of honest feedback as well, right?
Yes, yeah. So, I mean, this is, I think, the hardest part about psychological safety is if you're going into an organization where things are really, psychological safety is low and it's kind of rampant throughout the organization, it's going to be really difficult to do that on your own. And so I think, yeah, either maybe if it's really that bad, you might even bring an outside consultant in, or, again, use software maybe similar to Attuned, where you can kind of take some of the responsibility off of you and just use the kind of cold, hard numbers to, show the evidence that hopefully will convince people.
Yeah, for sure. I think a lot of people, when you say that psychological safety starts at the team level, it's important to think of the management group or the leadership group as a team as well, right? And
yes,
it's going to be hard to enact positive change at, the most basic team level if you don't have that kind of buy-in and at the top as well.
Yeah.
So the next question is, what are some indications of low psychological safety?
Yeah, I mean, so with low psychological safety, likely, this is just in a situation where they're just trying to go through their day, they're trying to keep their head down, just try to avoid, I'm just going to do what I need to do to get my job done, and avoid, if I can, interacting with any of my teammates. I'm not going to try to go the extra mile. I'm just going to, I have an idea, but I'm not going to share it. So really, I think when the psychological safety is low, you'll see this very kind of like quiet, separated type environment where people are not so much interacting with each other, where there's not a lot of ideas being shared. It's hard to get maybe brainstorming sessions going. And yeah, for employees, what employees might be feeling is just that kind of stress and fear when you go into an interaction. You're spending a lot of time worrying, like trying to plan, like, okay, how can I say this thing? Should I say this thing? You might be feeling stressed out because you're expecting somebody to disrespect you or to yell at you. So it can actually be, yeah. So again, the behaviors we'll see is just like not a lack of like idea sharing, a lack of knowledge sharing, people not reporting mistakes. And then feelings wise, just a lot of stress and anxiety and a lot of mental space taken up with trying to plan interactions and thinking about how you should do and say things around your teammates.
Wonderful, thank you. So the next question is a great one, and I think it kind of relates to the last question, is can moves towards a psychologically safe work environment start from team members, or can it only come from team leaders?
I know. So I think about that question a lot too. And so really, I mean, psychological safety, it has to be the whole team. And I focus a lot on specifically team members as driving the psychological safety interventions, or excuse me, team leaders being the ones driving the psychological safety interventions. But it really needs to be everyone on the team kind of participating and contributing to this. So yeah, I mean, I definitely think, especially again, if you have some sort of outside, if you have like maybe you band together as team members and really say like, hey, I've come across this, we come across this psychological safety concept. It sounds like it's really good. There's tons of benefits. We really think we might have a problem with this on the team. Can we, work together to try to improve this? That might be one way, kind of the collective working together. You might also consider maybe going to HR and seeing if HR would assist you or kind of step in. Probably your HR team is familiar with psychological safety, so that shouldn't be too much like explaining or convincing there. So yeah, it's much easier when the team leader is the one on board and driving this, but I do think that there's possible to do things, work with your teammates together to kind of drive this and bring this topic up.
Yeah, I think it takes courage, right?
Yeah, especially if it's really unsafe.
Yeah, and that exactly, like if you're already feeling like things are not safe, then it takes courage to speak up.
Mm-hmm.
to really enact that positive change. I guess, from my perspective, the question that everyone has to ask themselves if they feel like they're in that situation is, if people are not open to this discussion, can I continue to work in this environment? Like, how bad is it really? And, of course, like everyone's, especially I think now in with market uncertainty and the times, like, it takes a lot of bravery to say, like, if this doesn't improve, I might have to leave. But also, like, your ultimate happiness and how you feel about yourself, how you feel about your job, like, these things are all very connected. So
yes, and like I said before, psychological safety is literally one of the prime drivers of turnover. So it's when people don't have it, they really just feel dissatisfied and unhappy at work. So
the next question is another really interesting one, and maybe we're kind of touching on these points as well. But so when looking for a new job, what are good questions for a job seeker to ask a prospective employer to assess their workplace's psychological safety?
That's a really good question. Actually, it's so funny that you asked that, because previously in a job interview, this was like kind of when I first started getting into psychological safety. And I did a job interview, and I just literally straightforward asked the person interviewing me, what does your company do to support psychological safety? And that person had no idea what I was talking about. So that was a pretty good indication that nothing was happening there. I mean, to be fair, especially in a bigger company, like if somebody's not, close to HR, they might still have no idea, even if there are psychological safety initiatives being taken there. But I don't know, my approach to things like that in life are just to be direct, to specifically ask, what do you guys do for psychological safety? And if they don't know initially, you might explain a little bit, like, help people feel safe, help people feel like, we're not going to yell at you or make fun of you and stuff like that. You could just ask them about their values surrounding that behavior, supporting learning and innovation. Or you could say, like, how do you handle when somebody on your team makes a mistake? How do you handle mistake making? That kind of thing. So
I think that's a great question. To see what the communication is and how those kinds of things are handled. You could also ask questions around feedback, how feedback is given, when it's given. I think the values one is a really important one, because most companies these days, they do post the values. It's on the website. It's usually in part of the mission statement. And I think in the interview, like, one of the things that I would suggest is you try to identify, like, how closely do they live those values? Like, are you seeing those values come through in the interview? Are they asking you questions about their values to make sure that you're aligned, thinking that, okay, this is a two-way street? Then you can kind of get a sense of how important these things are to them. And I think, again, the direct question is probably the best, because it'll give you the answer, like, ultimately the answer or lack of answer that you want. But if you're talking to someone who may not, be as familiar with the concept, asking questions around that is probably good. Awesome. Well, I think we've gone through all the questions, and we've only got a couple minutes left anyway. I'd like to thank everyone that joined today and participated. Thank you for the wonderful questions. Melissa, thank you so much. I hope everyone took something away from this. I took something away from this, and we worked together. I found it very interesting. And just to let everyone know, we will have another webinar in June. This is going to be about nudges and how we can get people to, how we can kind of nudge people through motivators, how we can kind of create more positive behavior in the workplace. So keep an eye out for that. Thank you again to everyone, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you, Melissa.
bye.